Robinson, founder of RPGresearch.com, and I'm just going to share some musings I have about a group I'm running right now through the original Tomb of Horrors, the old first edition Dungeons & Dragons adventure by Gary Gygax, but using the new Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. We're still early yet, we've only had one session so far, and just wanted to make some comparisons. During the previous months we were playing the original Dungeons & Dragons box set, the classic booklets repackaged into the wooden box, and then new artwork and of course all the copyright compliant portions that they had to get rid of. For example, the deities and demigods equivalent that used to have more content and halfling instead of hobbit. But we've been playing original Dungeons & Dragons, and we did it with A0, which was a precursor to the A1 through 4 Slave Lords series. And everybody had fun with that. First level characters using original D&D. And what was very interesting to note is the trend in the last 15 years to de-mechanize role-playing gaming and focus a little more on story and using more simplistic systems really seems like a full circle. The original D&D really, didn't have skills. It had a very simple system. I mean, the very first booklet, it's all 6-sided dice and a D20, and that's pretty much it. And then as they added the supplements, they started to change it, so you use different sized dice for combat and for hit points, etc. And then finally, in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, all those mechanics came together in a much more complicated version of D&D than came out in the original version. So all these other role-playing game systems that have tried to go back to simplicity, in a lot of ways, are going back to those same roots. And we've had a lot of fun playing with that simplicity. It's complicated in that because the books are kind of scattered around where all the resource material was, it wasn't the easiest thing to look up. But since it was a simple enough system, there isn't that much you have to keep looking up compared to later versions of D&D where you're constantly having to reference rules. Now we're at 5th edition. I luckily had early access to it through the game store, and so we were playing the basic version of it early on back in June, and then early in August, even before Gen Con, with the full player's handbook. And there is a series on the youtube.com/RPGresearch, or if you go to rpgresearch.com website, I am providing a review, almost page by page, not quite, but almost a page by page review of the book. I'm not going into every little nitty-gritty detail of every rule and every facet of every race and every facet of every class. There's already plenty of other sites that do that. Remember, for RPG Research, my background is recreation therapy, research psychology, and studying the impact of role-playing games on participants, and then the potential use from a therapeutic perspective as an intervention modality, using role-playing games to help specific populations. For example, I've done a series so far with autism spectrum toddlers, and looking forward to doing some future work with autism spectrum youth and adults. Also have a program planned for traumatic brain injury recovery, and lots of other possible populations. So my perspective is going to be a little different than your typical gamer. Also, my background. I've been gaming since 1979, and I've hosted my own little gaming conventions at an early age, and then again in later years with a J.R.R. Tolkien focus. And my emphasis is usually story over rules. However, one of my favorite systems in the 80s was Rollmaster and MERP. We usually take MERP and then add the Rollmaster rules to add the complexity. And I loved that complexity. But I'm not one of those gamers that is rigidly focused on has to be complex mechanics. I do enjoy that. I enjoy that, the number crunching and the math and the charts and the expression. But I also know that that can get in the way for certain gamers. There are plenty of gamers that that's not appealing and would turn them off to role-playing and de-emphasizes the story. While with other gamers, it doesn't interfere. For them, it's an enhancement, and that's fine too. So it really depends on your players and your game master and knowing the right balance. And so in my case, I have different groups that I run and I play in, and they're of very different levels of complexity with different game systems. So we did the same group that we went through with original Dungeons & Dragons through the precursor to Slave Lords. I'm putting them through the classic Tomb of Horrors. And I put several other groups through it back in the 80s, and I think it was 3 groups. There might have been more, but I remember 3 groups. And of those 3 groups, 2 did not quite make it all the way through. They one by one died, their characters. And 1 group, all but 2, failed to make it. The group made it to the big finale, and then several more were killed off, and only 2 were able to actually finish the adventure all the way. Tomb of Horrors is brutal. And that's what it was designed for. Gary Gygax basically said he used it to take his high-level advanced players and characters down a peg. He felt they were getting a little cocky and they needed a little humility. And the emphasis on at least the AD&D version, my understanding, I'm aware there's a 2nd edition and 3rd edition and 4th edition. I have not seen those versions yet. I'm looking for a reasonably affordable version, purchase those and compare them. But I have earlier 1st edition versions. This was mostly the one I put my players through. But then there's also the republished Dungeons of Dread, and so S1 is of course the first one. I'm putting the group through it. They all know it's Tomb of Horrors. Only 1 or 2 of the players as in my age group and remembers vaguely what it was like, but he doesn't remember any of the details, and he's not even certain how far he went into it. But everybody else, they're young enough, 30s or younger, they don't have any exposure to it. But they've been warned, and I had a whole precursor I wrote up explaining that this is a thinker's adventure. So some key differences, because they are using 5th edition, which has skills, I needed to lay some house rules, ground rules, about how this would be a little bit different than other implementations of 5th edition. In this game, it's really focusing more on the players. There's less separation. In other games, I try to keep, hey, this is your character, this is character knowledge, this is you as a player. They are separate for the most part. You shouldn't mix those up too much. There's always a blend, but you always try to keep some separation there for that ROLE playing. And that's what when you have a system that has skills, you roll a lot of times to gather information. So for example, you come into a room, I give a brief description, and then you might roll a search or spot to see if you find stuff, and then I would read more to you. However, that would kind of defeat Tomb of Horrors the way it was originally written. And again, I have not seen the 3rd and 4th editions version of it, which I understand they turned into a whole campaign. Taking the 1st edition, which did not have skills at all, there are no proficiencies, no skills, you had stat rolls, and maybe if you were a thief, you had skill rolls for thief abilities. But for the most part, you have to think it out and puzzle it out. And so I gave them a heads up to that effect, gave examples of what they could and couldn't do. So for example, they come in the room and they want to search it, just rolling a search, or with 5th edition now you might use perception, or you might use any of the others, or your stats, depending on how you want to apply it. You're not going to do that up front. Instead, what you're going to say is, my character does this specific action. I'm moving along with a 10-foot pole, tapping every 3 inches, applying about 30% of my weight, 20 pounds worth, whatever, and feeling for anything that sounds different, hear anything different, feel for anything different, etc. And I'm going to walk along in a pattern and come back, etc. So that's what the player should be saying to me. For the most part, I can then just describe what happens. However, there are some parts where there's a percentage of success where even that will work, and that would be the point at which they would roll a spot or a search or other similar skill. In 5th edition, which again, I've got a series of reviews up on the website, 3 so far, more on the way. You have your passive wisdom perception check, or regular perception skills, and of course you have stealth and survival and a lot of other skills, and of course your stat rolls to make. I'm trying in Tomb of Horrors to discourage them from relying too heavily on those mechanics and really, really thinking it out. So they've all been warned about that, and it's gone fairly well. It's a large group, which is encouraged for this game. Some of the players are even playing 2 characters because it has such a high fatality rate. We have 6 players this first session. The next session looks like we may have 7 or 8. We have about 12 characters in the dungeon, so that allows for a few extras in case somebody dies. They can take over another one. And it's been interesting to watch. And it has, for the most part, unfolded the same as it did in the 1st edition days when I put the other groups through. So that's been interesting. But there have been some notable differences. For example,